All right, so in my last lecture, I talked about two ideas. Social Darwinism, which was the idea that it was natural and justified for strong groups of people to dominate weaker groups of people, and therefore any type of aggression and that sort of stuff, oppression in society, was justified because if you made it to the top, that this was proof of your superiority. And I talked about how that intertwined with the notion of manifest destiny, or the idea that it was inevitable and was a good thing that the United States would ultimately expand its borders westward until it reached the edge of the continent. And I left off talking about ideas that come into being in the late 1800s, that it was actually our westward expansion, our repeated displacing of Native American tribes and building up colonies further and further west, that this constant rebuilding of society and rediscovering our primitive roots, that this was what made America exceptional. And this was the explanation that a lot of Americans were offering amongst themselves for the dramatic economic growth that America is undergoing in the late 1800s. So if you've adopted this narrative, if you believe that expanding our borders, that conquering more territory was the explanation for why America was great, why America was becoming this predominant economic power on the world stage, well, once there's nowhere to go further west, people start looking around for other ways to expand the American empire. And this is where we're going to start off today with the Spanish-American War. And the Spanish-American War starts on February 15th, 1898, at about 9:40 in the evening. And basically there's an explosion aboard this U.S. ship, the USS Maine. The ship sinks, most of the sailors on board lose their lives, and the president at the time gives a speech immediately. He urges the American people to be patient. He doesn't declare that Spain had caused the explosion, but a lot of people are understandably hurt and frustrated by the loss of 250 American military lives. And this captivates the attention of the American people. Most American leaders continue to take the position that the cause of the explosion was unknown. And truth be told, historians that have gone back and looked at this have determined that it was probably accidental, that there was a faulty boiler in the ship's engine room that exploded and sunk the ship. But the press ultimately starts to blame Spain. They start rallying support for going to war against Spain under the slogan, "Remember the Maine." Now, despite the fact that the president tries his best to calm this situation, within months Congress has declared war. And there's really a number of reasons why this happens, and I just want to kind of talk a little bit about it. The first reason was economic. And in order to understand that, the first thing I need to go into is the fact that we call it the Spanish-American War, but just about everyone else outside of the United States refers to this war by a different name, the Cuban War for Independence. Now, Cuba in 1800 was a colony of Spain. Americans, however, had been eyeing Cuba for a very long time. In the mid-19th century, many people felt that the island was going to make an ideal addition as a new state. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson in 1820 described Cuba as, quote, "the most interesting addition which could ever be made to our system of states." He said that the U.S. ought at the first possible opportunity to take Cuba. And this was his instructions to his Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun. So this wasn't just an offhand comment. He was instructing his Secretary of War, we should start taking actions that are moving towards taking control of Cuba. There was efforts made before the Civil War to purchase Cuba and make it a new slave territory. This ultimately fails. And once we get involved in the Civil War, people's minds are kind of off Cuba. But from an economic perspective, the Civil War doesn't really end our interest there. U.S. businessmen began investing, really monopolizing the sugar markets in Cuba in the second half of the 19th century, the 1800s. And by 1894, about 90% of Cuba's total exports are going to the United States. So the Cuban economy, for all intents and purposes, is driven by the U.S. and U.S. money. 40% of their imports are coming from the United States, and this is all why there's still a Spanish colony, right? Spain technically controls them, but we control their economy. So the U.S. had this important economic interest that people felt were being harmed by this prolonged conflict that was going on, because the Cuban War for Independence had started in 1895. This had been going on for 3 years. There was this deepening uncertainty about the future of Cuba. And shipping firms that had relied heavily on trade with Cuba were suffering losses as long as this conflict continued unresolved. But also, Americans had this strategic reason for wanting to support going to war in Cuba. The U.S. in the second half of the 19th century had really become incredibly interested in constructing a canal, either in Nicaragua or Panama. Ultimately, we do get this constructed, the Panama Canal. But we wanted this because it would be really great for U.S. international trade. It would reduce the time it took for ships to travel between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. But this route would also require naval protection. And we didn't really have any easy means of providing it, but people reasoned that if Cuba became an independent nation under American protection, we could really easily maintain a naval presence there and protect our trade routes. Other people supported intervention in Cuba for humanitarian reasons. There were these highly publicized atrocities committed by Spaniards. It was circulated around the country through the newspapers, convincing people that if they did not necessarily support Cuban independence, Spain needed to go, because Spain was kind of being depicted as this villain. There were also these ideological reasons, right? I talked about social Darwinism, and how much of this westward expansion had been driven by the ideology of manifest destiny, that is the responsibility of white men to spread their superior culture to uncivilized Native American tribes. Well, after the closing of the West, many people start applying this same logic, like I said, to international affairs. And as African nations are starting to get colonized by European powers in the late 1800s and early 1900s, many people start to feel that the U.S. is late getting into the colonialism game. Right? These social Darwinistic theories that had been used in support of domestic politics start being applied to the world stage. Strong nations need to dominate weaker ones. This is in accordance with natural law. And if we aren't expanding our borders, if we aren't going out and conquering new territories, well, we see Europe doing this in Africa. They're going to grow stronger and stronger and stronger, and what's going to stop them from ultimately conquering us, right? So social Darwinism, we need to stay strong. Other people wanted to go to war simply as revenge, right? I talked about the press and the reporting of this. Many people saw this as an unprovoked attack against the United States by Spain. And this was really fueled by the press coverage. It played a major part in creating this perception. After the Maine was destroyed, New York City newspapers, publishers like William Randolph Hearst of the New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World decided that the Spanish were to blame. They recognized that there was a potential for great headlines and stories that were going to sell a lot of copies of their paper, so they publicized this theory as fact. They used sensationalistic accounts of atrocities committed by the Spanish in Cuba, using headlines like "Spanish murderers, remember the Maine." The press exaggerated what was happening and how the Spanish were treating Cuban prisoners, although these were based on factual accounts most of the time. They embellished them, and they used incendiary language, which caused an emotional response, an often heated response from readers. So the press really plays an important role in mobilizing support for this war. But then there was a lot of other people that just saw this as an opportunity to prove their manhood. We'd had the Civil War before, and a lot of people saw the Civil War after a few decades had passed as this defining moment that had really kind of turned boys into men. And there was a lot of people saying that the country needed a war. Among them was Teddy Roosevelt. He was saying, we need a war. I don't even care what kind of war. And in fact, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he stepped down from his role in order to go fight in this war once war was declared. So within a few months of the bombing of the Maine, we are at war. And this is a pretty short war. It begins in April, it ends in July. America emerges victorious. Only about 460 Americans die in battle, although another 5,200 die from disease during this. And you could be tempted to say this was a quick and easy victory for the United States, because it was, but it really says less about American strength than it does to the degree which Cuba had already weakened the Spanish forces by the time we get involved, right? I mentioned this was the Cuban War for Independence, and that it had been going on for 3 years. Well, Cuba was pretty much winning this war. And we joined in and kind of cleaned things up a little bit, maybe accelerated the end of the war, but we didn't necessarily defeat Spain all on our own. And in fact, we made a lot of mistakes. There were supply problems, there weren't enough rifles and ammunition and food to go around. And we only had about 28,000 army troops that we were able to send over, so the fact that we couldn't properly supply them says a lot about how unprepared we were for this. Also, we didn't really think about the fact that it was in the summer, and this was a war being fought in the Caribbean, in a tropical climate. We send our troops over with these big, heavy wool uniforms. But the war does ultimately end in our favor, and it is ended by the Treaty of Paris in 1898. This was negotiated on terms favorable to the U.S. It allowed us temporary control of Cuba. It gave us ownership of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippine Islands. But it doesn't consider input from Cuba, from Puerto Rico, from Guam, or the Philippines. This is a peace treaty negotiated strictly between Spain and the United States. Now, officially, we deny any intentions of exerting control over Cuba or any of these other countries following the war. But we do end up occupying Cuba for about 4 years. Now, this wasn't all bad. We did build roads, hospitals, schools, things like this. But we also laid the basis for decades of American economic domination of the island. We only agreed to withdraw our troops from Cuba once they agreed to the Platt Amendment, which just basically said they weren't allowed to enter into treaties with foreign nations without our authorization. And it also gave us permission to interfere in their affairs if we needed to for, quote, the maintenance of good government. And lastly, it forced Cuba to lease us land to open up a naval base on the island. This was Guantanamo Bay. It was opened in 1898, remains under American possession to this day. Now, as for the other major acquisition under the Treaty of Paris, the Philippines, this was a very similar situation. They were involved in their own struggle for independence from Spain when we stepped into this war, and they didn't particularly appreciate the fact that their input wasn't being valued in the peace negotiations. And they didn't appreciate the fact that it seemed like they were being kind of swapped out for one colonial ruler for another. Now, the president at the time, he basically said, William McKinley, that he was very conflicted about this, but after a long, drawn-out period of reflection, he decided there were no acceptable alternatives other than for us to take control of the island. He was not about to let the Philippines be independent. But while he is making this decision, the Philippines have set up their own government. They've drafted a constitution under the revolutionary leader of the Philippines, Emilio Aguinaldo. And this constitution is modeled after our own constitution. And so when we step in and try to assume control, this sparks off this major drawn-out fight for independence that lasts for about 3 years, so much longer than the Spanish-American War did. Also, as I mentioned before, there were not many U.S. casualties during the Spanish-American War, but there were about 4,000 dead U.S. soldiers by the end of the Philippines War and more than 50,000 dead Filipino citizens. And so this really marks kind of the period in which the United States becomes an empire in the sense that it starts looking outside of the what is now the continental United States and asserting its authority abroad.